you heard a voice crying for help in an empty house, would you walk away or step inside? A small child, an abandoned house, a voice whispering for help. Jamal, just 6 years old, stood at the edge of his neighborhood, the sun barely making it over the horizon. The street was quiet, almost too quiet for a place that should have been full of kids playing, families bustling in and out of houses. But this was a different kind of place. This was his world, the one where life didn't wait for you to grow up. Jamal had always been a curious kid. He loved to explore, to wander the streets and discover the things that no one else paid attention to. But today, something felt different. Something in the air told him to be cautious, but his heart told him to keep going. His neighborhood wasn't a friendly one. The houses were old, some abandoned, others barely holding on. There was always talk about the place at the end of the street, the old house that had been empty for as long as Jamal could remember. People whispered about it. Some said it was haunted. Others just said it was bad luck. But Jamal, he wasn't afraid of stories. He was just a kid. And kids, well, they didn't see things the way adults did. He didn't care about the rumors. All he knew was that the house fascinated him. Lately, though, something had changed. For weeks, he'd seen lights flicker in the windows at night, shadows moving behind the broken glass. Strange sounds drifted on the breeze, noises that didn't quite belong. They weren't the creaks of an old house. They were something else, something alive. And today, Jamal had been walking home from school when he heard it. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it was there, weak, desperate. A voice calling for help. He froze in place. Should he keep walking? Should he ignore it, like everyone else did? After all, he was just a kid. Kids weren't supposed to be involved in things like this. They were supposed to go home, eat dinner, and do their homework. But this wasn't the world Jamal lived in. In his world, you had to listen. You had to pay attention, because if you didn't, no one else would. He hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. The street was empty. No one was watching. No one cared. This was his moment. He could keep walking, pretend he didn't hear anything. But what if someone inside needed help? Jamal swallowed hard and took a step forward, his small feet crunching on the gravel as he approached the house. The old wooden door creaked as it opened just a crack, inviting him in. "Hello," Jamal called, his voice barely louder than a whisper. The air inside was stale, filled with dust and the smell of old wood. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, scanning the room. Everything was still. But there it was again, faint, like a soft cry. It was coming from upstairs. Without thinking, Jamal stepped further into the house. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't turn back now. The voice was calling him, pulling him closer. Who was it? What were they asking for? Why did they need him? He climbed the creaky stairs slowly, each step feeling like a challenge, but his curiosity kept him going. As he reached the top of the stairs, he saw it, a door slightly ajar. He was about to knock, but before his hand could reach the door, it swung open with a loud screech. "Help me!" The voice was weak, trembling. Jamal's eyes widened, and he stepped inside. "Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below. Help, please." Without thinking, Jamal pushed the door open. It groaned loudly, but he didn't care. His heart was in his throat as he stepped into the basement. The cold air hit him immediately, more biting than it had been upstairs. The basement smelled like old cement and mildew, and Jamal could barely see through the thick darkness. He stepped cautiously, his eyes darting around. It was then that he saw her, a woman. She was tied to a chair, her body hunched forward. She was gagged, bruised, her face pale with fear. Tears streaked down her face, glistening in the dim light. She looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes, her body trembling as she shook her head in desperation. Jamal's stomach twisted. He could feel the fear radiating off of her, but he didn't understand everything. He didn't need to. What he did know was that she needed help. She was scared, and he was the only one here. His little heart pounded harder, but he stayed calm, trying to think clearly. The woman's eyes never left his. Her silent pleas were louder than anything Jamal had ever heard. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice barely louder than a breath. "I'll help you." He stepped closer, not sure what he was supposed to do, but knowing he couldn't leave her like this. He looked around the basement, his eyes landing on a sharp piece of broken wood near the wall. He grabbed it and rushed to the woman, but before he could reach her, he heard a noise, the faintest sound of footsteps coming closer. Panic rose in his chest. He didn't know who was coming, but he couldn't let them catch him here. His hands shook as he worked to untie the ropes around her wrists. The woman's eyes were frantic now, urging him to hurry, to finish. With a final tug, the rope came loose, and the woman's hands were free. She raised her arms shakily, rubbing her wrists. "Please, don't leave me," she gasped. "I'm not going anywhere," Jamal replied, trying to steady his voice, though he was just as scared as she was. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. The man was tall, dark, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the anger in his eyes. The woman gasped, her hand reaching out to Jamal as she tried to stand, but she collapsed back into the chair, too weak. "Who are you?" The man's voice was low, threatening. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them." Jamal looked up to see a group of police officers storming into the basement, their guns drawn, aimed straight at him. "No, no, no!" Jamal cried out, raising his hands instinctively. "I didn't do anything." But it didn't matter. They weren't listening. They didn't care about what he was saying. The officer who had spoken first, Officer Daniels, took a step forward. His cold, narrowed eyes scanned Jamal's face, and the anger in his voice was unmistakable. "What's a little kid like you doing in here?" he asked, his tone full of suspicion. Jamal's heart was racing. He was just trying to help. He had freed the woman. He wasn't the criminal here. But to them, he was just another black boy in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Did someone send you?" Officer Daniels continued, taking another step forward. "Or were you trying to steal?" Jamal's mind raced. He wanted to shout, to tell them everything. He wanted to explain that he was just a kid, that he had found the woman and saved her. But the words caught in his throat. "No, I didn't do anything," Jamal cried again, his voice desperate. But the officers didn't listen. They moved quickly, grabbing him by the arms. One officer yanked him harshly to his feet, and Jamal winced as his arm was twisted behind his back. His heart raced even faster, and his body shook with fear. The woman, now free from the ropes, stumbled to her feet, her eyes wide with panic. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. "He's the one who saved me. He didn't do anything wrong." But Officer Daniels wasn't listening. He was too busy glaring at Jamal, pushing him toward the exit. "You're coming with us, kid," another officer said, his grip tight around Jamal's arm. Jamal was scared. He didn't know what was going to happen to him. The officers didn't care about his story, his side of things. They only saw a black boy in the wrong place, at the wrong time. "No!" Jamal shouted, his voice full of panic. "I didn't do anything. I helped her." But they didn't care. His cries didn't matter. They didn't matter to them because he wasn't the person they were looking for. He was just another kid, invisible, discarded. To them, he wasn't a hero. He was a problem to be solved. The woman tried to run toward them, but the officers held her back, ignoring her pleas. "Stay out of it, ma'am," one of them said coldly. Jamal was being dragged toward the door. He was overwhelmed, scared, and now, more than ever, he wished he hadn't tried to help. He had been so sure, so certain that doing the right thing would make everything better. But it didn't. The world saw him differently. The world didn't see him as the hero. And right now, the world didn't believe him. Have you ever been in a situation where no one believed you? Tell us your story. The tension in the room was thick, the officers still holding on to Jamal, his arms pinned behind his back. But everything paused when the woman spoke again. "I am the wife of CIA Director William Harris." The words hung in the air, shocking everyone in the room. The officers froze. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The officer holding Jamal's arm stiffened, his eyes wide. "What?" he muttered under his breath, his gaze flickering between the woman and Jamal. "I said, I'm the wife of CIA Director William Harris," the woman repeated, her voice still shaky but with more conviction now. She struggled to catch her breath, her body trembling from the ordeal. "This boy, he saved my life." The officer stepped back, his grip on Jamal loosening. His face turned pale as the realization of who they were dealing with set in. Jamal had been right all along, but the officers hadn't believed him. They had treated him like a criminal, not knowing who he truly was or what he had done. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice quiet now, his earlier confidence fading. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving Jamal. "Yes. I had been taken, kidnapped. He found me and helped me. He's the reason I'm here, alive. It was this boy, not anyone else, who saved me." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, realizing that they had made a mistake. The realization hit them hard. The young boy they had almost arrested wasn't the criminal they had assumed him to be. In fact, Jamal was the hero in this situation, and they had been wrong. "Let him go," the woman said, her voice firm now, though still strained from the emotional shock. "You were about to arrest the one person who helped me." The lead officer, clearly flustered, nodded hesitantly and stepped back, finally releasing his grip on Jamal. The room fell into a heavy silence as the full impact of the moment sank in. Jamal stood there, his heart pounding, still trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. His chest tightened with fear, but something else too. Relief. His hands shook as he took a step back, his eyes meeting the woman's. "You're free," she said, offering a weak smile. "Thank you. You're the reason I'm still here." Jamal didn't know what to say. He was just a boy, one who had found the courage to help when it counted. But now, standing in the midst of a room full of officers who had been prepared to arrest him, it felt surreal. He looked up at the woman, still processing what had just happened. I didn't do it for any reward," Jamal mumbled, his voice soft. "I just wanted to help. I didn't want anyone to hurt you." The officers, still in shock, backed away. One of them turned to the woman. "Ma'am, we didn't know. We're sorry for the misunderstanding." The woman shook her head. "You were just doing your job. But this boy did more than any of us could have. He saved me." Jamal's mind was racing, but he couldn't help the smile that began to spread across his face. For the first time in his life, he wasn't seen as just another troublemaker. He wasn't invisible. He was being acknowledged for doing the right thing. His heart swelled with a mix of pride and relief, but then his smile faded as he remembered what had led him to this moment. He had been alone. He had been abandoned. He had been just another kid people ignored. But today he had made a difference. The lead officer turned to the others, his voice still hesitant. "I'll make sure this is reported. You did the right thing, son. You did the right thing." Jamal looked back at the woman, his mind still a whirlwind. She was staring at him, her expression filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice full of sincerity. Jamal shook his head. "You don't have to. I did what anyone should have done." As the officers left the scene, leaving the woman and Jamal alone in the quiet of the room, the weight of the moment slowly settled on Jamal's shoulders. He had done more than he could ever have imagined. He had done the right thing. Jamal had saved a life. He was no longer just a kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was someone who mattered. What would you have done in Jamal's place? Drop your thoughts below. The officers, now completely embarrassed, fumbled as they undid Jamal's restraints. The cold metal handcuffs fell to the floor with a clink, and the weight of what had just transpired hung heavy in the room. They muttered their apologies, but couldn't look Jamal in the eye. The shame of nearly ruining the life of an innocent child was enough to silence them. Jamal stood, still shaken, but a little more assured now. He had done the right thing. He had saved a life, but in the process, he had also opened up an entirely new chapter for himself. The room fell silent as the weight of the situation fully settled in. The news of Jamal's heroism spread like wildfire. The story made headlines across the country. News stations reported on the 6-year-old homeless black boy rescues pregnant woman, exposes kidnapping plot. Videos of Jamal's brave action circulated online, and for the first time, he was seen as more than just a boy from the streets. He was a symbol of hope, courage, and the kind of quiet strength that went unnoticed by most. Days later, as the spotlight on Jamal grew brighter, something unimaginable happened. The door to his foster home opened one afternoon, and standing there in a tailored suit was none other than CIA Director William Harris, the same man whose wife Jamal had saved. The same man whose daughter had been snatched from the clutches of a kidnapper thanks to this young boy's quick thinking. Jamal's eyes widened. The powerful man in front of him knelt down, lowering himself to eye level with the boy. The difference in their worlds was stark. The man's expensive suit, his polished shoes, and the aura of authority that surrounded him were the very things Jamal had spent his whole life looking up to, but never thought he'd be in the same room with. "You saved my wife and my child," Director Harris said, his voice calm but filled with deep gratitude. "And now, I want to change your life." Jamal's breath caught in his chest. He didn't know what to say. How could he respond to such a thing? "I want to give you a future beyond the streets, Jamal," Harris continued. "A future where you're seen, where you're valued." The words hung in the air, impossibly heavy. Jamal had only ever known the harshness of the streets. He had never imagined that anyone like Director Harris, someone so powerful, would ever look at him as anything more than just another statistic. "I'm offering you a full scholarship," Harris said. "A chance to go to school, to live in a place where you won't have to worry about food, where you can have a future." Jamal stood there, stunned. A full scholarship? A new home? The chance to actually have a future that wasn't dictated by where he had been born, by the color of his skin, or the circumstances of his life. It was too much. His heart raced, and for a moment, he didn't know what to think. He had lived through years of rejection, abandonment, and hardship. No one had ever believed in him. He had always been the kid who didn't matter, the kid who was invisible to the world. But now, someone was offering him something he had never dared to dream of. "I don't know what to say," Jamal finally whispered. "I never thought I'd get a chance like that." Harris smiled gently. "You deserve this chance. You deserve a life where you don't have to fight just to survive." Jamal looked down at his shoes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had always been told he would never amount to anything. But now, here was an opportunity to prove everyone wrong. An opportunity to live a life that was bigger than the one he had been dealt. For the first time in his life, Jamal allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something better. "I'll take it," he said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "I'll take it." Director Harris smiled, standing up and offering Jamal a hand. "Good, because this is only the beginning." Jamal shook the man's hand, feeling the warmth and strength of someone who truly believed in him. He wasn't just a street kid anymore. He was someone who mattered. In that moment, Jamal realized that everything had changed. He wasn't invisible anymore. And with the opportunities ahead of him, he knew his life would never be the same. Would you accept the offer? Or would you walk away? Tell us what you'd do. Jamal stood in his new home, a place that felt like a dream. His fingers lightly brushed against the key in his hand, the symbol of the life he had never imagined could be his. Just weeks ago, he had been another child lost in the system, a boy with nothing but his wits and a determination to survive. But now, as he looked around the clean, well-kept room, he knew his life had changed forever. The place was far from perfect, but it was his. It wasn't a shelter or an alleyway or some forgotten corner of the world. It was a real home. And for the first time in a long time, Jamal allowed himself to believe in what it felt like to belong. As he stood there, staring at the key, memories of everything that had led him here rushed through his mind. The streets, the hardships, the pain of being overlooked and misunderstood. For years, he had been seen as a problem, just another statistic. But today, everything had shifted. He was no longer invisible. He had a future now, a chance to prove that he was more than just the label others had tried to place on him. Director Harris stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Jamal's shoulder. His voice was calm, steady, filled with sincerity. "You don't owe anyone an apology for being who you are," he said, his words a quiet but powerful reassurance. "The world will try to judge you before they know you, but you just proved them all wrong." Jamal looked up at him, the weight of those words sinking in. He had always been told that people like him couldn't make it, that kids from his neighborhood, from his situation, didn't stand a chance. But now, standing in this room, with the support of someone who believed in him, Jamal knew that those opinions meant nothing. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a new sense of determination. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice steady. "I did." For the first time, Jamal felt proud of himself, not just for surviving, but for standing up for what was right. The choice he had made that day to save someone's life, the courage he had shown when no one else would have, had led him here. And no one could take that away from him. The future was wide open now. There would be challenges ahead, but Jamal knew he was ready for them. He had fought for his place in this world, and now it was his time to live. He wasn't just the boy from the streets anymore. He was someone who had proven his worth, and his worth was more than anyone had ever given him credit for. As he stood there, feeling the weight of his newfound future, Jamal smiled. He had done it. He had beaten the odds. The world may have seen him as a villain before, but today it had to see him for who he truly was. A hero. The camera pulled away, leaving Jamal standing in his new home. A boy who had changed his own fate. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Drop a comment below. He Grand Ballroom, once filled with the soft sound of clinking glasses and light-hearted conversation, had taken on an uncomfortable stillness. The murmurs from the guests faded as Michael's voice broke through the air. "You think you belong here?" His tone was sharp, laced with mockery, and it drew the attention of everyone within earshot. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She could feel all eyes turning toward them, the weight of their stares heavy upon her. She hadn't expected this. Not here, not now. The crystal chandeliers above flickered ever so slightly, as if reacting to the tension in the room. Michael's eyes, usually full of charm and arrogance, were now filled with contempt as he leaned back in his chair, the corners of his lips twitching into a smirk. "I brought you here. I made you, and you're embarrassing me." He waved a hand dismissively toward Tasha, as if she were a minor inconvenience rather than his wife. Tasha felt the color drain from her face. The words stung, but it wasn't the first time he'd said something like this to her. The private jabs, the subtle insults, it had all been part of their marriage. But this was different. This was public. The guests at nearby tables exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to react. No one stepped in. No one even seemed to care. Tasha swallowed hard. She could feel the tears threatening to rise, but she wouldn't let them fall. Not here, not now. She stared at Michael, her fingers gripping the edge of her napkin, as she fought to keep her composure. "Michael, please," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's no need to do this in front of everyone." But Michael didn't listen. His gaze was cold, piercing, and he was enjoying this, enjoying the power he held over her, the control that no one ever seemed to question. "Oh, but there is," he sneered. "You think you've earned your place here, don't you?" He laughed, a cruel sound that seemed to echo through the room. "People like you. You're not meant for this life." Tasha's chest tightened. She could feel every second of this humiliation, every word that Michael had thrown her way. The insults weren't new. She'd dealt with them in private, behind closed doors for years. But this was different. This was public, meant to degrade her in front of all these people. "You don't even know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice shaking. "I've worked just as hard as anyone else in this room." But Michael wasn't listening. He was on a roll, enjoying the discomfort he was causing, enjoying her pain. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're nothing but a trophy on my arm. You've always been. You have no place in my world, in my life. You were nothing before me, and I made you something." Each word felt like a slap, each one a reminder of just how little he thought of her. She had been nothing more than a possession to him, something to be paraded around for status, to make him look good. Tasha fought to stay calm, her fists clenched tightly under the table. She couldn't let this go on, not anymore. "Stop," she said, her voice low but firm. "Just stop." You can't talk to me like that." For the first time, she found the strength to speak up, to say something that wasn't meant to appease him, to placate him. But Michael was relentless, the words pouring out of him with venom. "You think you're worthy of standing here beside me, beside the people in this room? You're a nobody, and you always will be." The crowd watched, frozen. Some looked uncomfortable, some looked away, but no one intervened. No one did anything, and that was the worst part. Tasha's throat tightened as she held her ground, trying to keep the tears from falling. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. She wasn't going to let him break her down here in front of everyone. "You think you can break me with your words?" she continued, her gaze sweeping over the room. "Did you think I would just sit here and take it? Did you think I would always stay silent?" The room was silent. Even Michael's confident sneer began to falter. The guests, once more concerned with their own conversations, now turned their eyes toward Tasha, waiting. They could feel the shift in the air, the palpable tension between what Michael thought he controlled and what Tasha was about to reclaim. Tasha's voice rose, quiet but unwavering. "What you don't realize, Michael, is that you've underestimated me for far too long. You think you can just crush me, belittle me, control me, because you think I'm nothing more than a trophy to you. But you're wrong." Michael's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to her speaking back. His smirk slowly turned into a scowl. "You're really going to make a scene over this, Tasha? This is pathetic." But Tasha was far from finished. She turned to face the crowd, her gaze steady, as though she was taking them all in for the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're witnessing something interesting tonight. A man so desperate to control me, he would rather break me in public than respect me in private." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The guests were unsure of how to react. This wasn't the Tasha they knew, the woman who had always smiled, always played the part of the dutiful wife. This was something new, something powerful. Michael's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened, frustration flooding his face. His sense of control was slipping, and he didn't know how to regain it. Tasha wasn't done. "I may have walked in here as Michael's wife," she continued, her voice unwavering, "but I refuse to leave here as his shadow. I am more than that." Her words hung in the air, carrying weight. It was as if the entire room collectively held its breath, each person unsure of what would come next. Michael didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, he was silent. The applause didn't come immediately, but Tasha could feel it. She could feel the shift in the room, the shift in the power dynamic. Michael's control was being dismantled piece by piece. "You have treated me like I am beneath you," she said, her eyes now burning with the conviction she had long hidden. "But I'm not your subordinate. I'm not your servant. I'm not your property." Michael's frustration was now palpable. His hands clenched into fists. "You're making a fool of yourself, Tasha," he spat. But she stood her ground unmoved. "I'm not the one making a fool of anyone," she replied coolly. "You are." The crowd was silent now, each person processing what they had just witnessed. Tasha had finally spoken up, finally said enough. She wasn't just Michael's wife anymore. She was a woman standing up for herself, for her own worth, in front of everyone who had ever underestimated her. Her gaze never left Michael's, but she no longer cared about his reaction. For the first time, she felt free, unburdened by the chains of his expectations. "So, go ahead," she continued, her voice softer now. "You can't control me anymore." Michael stood there, speechless, the fury in his eyes unable to mask the growing realization that he had lost control. It wasn't just over the situation, it was over her. And Tasha, for the first time in years, felt the weight of his control lift. If you were in Tasha's shoes, what would you say? Comment below.